Hi, I'm Kurt, and on today's episode of Granworks, I finished building this, a 20th century industrial style trestle kitchen table. And I got to use fire to do that, and that's always fun. Stay tuned. We start again with the Restoration Harder 20th Century Industrial Trestle Table as the inspiration and my SketchUp model. In the previous video, I built the base for the table, leaving only the top remaining. As you can see, it shows a top that is at most 1 inch thick and doesn't have any breadboard ends. So that was my original goal, and to accomplish it, I got a bunch of 4/4 poplar and started arranging it to figure out how it might work for a table that is 42 inches wide and about 7 feet long. But I was just about to get a reminder of why it's important to wear gloves when handling stacks of lumber in my workshop. Oh yeah, that's a scorpion. And not just any scorpion. That's a bark scorpion, which is the most venomous scorpion in the US. It's one of the few scorpions worldwide that has venom that could be considered lethal. Oh, I hate those monstrous creatures with a vengeance. Whereas I might just relocate a spider. No, I kill any scorpion I find. Anyway, I quickly learned that the lumber I had on hand for the top was essentially unusable as is. Most of the boards were notably cupped or bowed, or even worse, notably twisted. I spent quite a bit of time trying to mill it down to the straight enough for a tabletop. This included skip planing, hand planing, and jointing. I also ripped in half some of the more egregious boards since wide boards tend to amplify the effects of the twist. In the end, it simply didn't work. Milling the 7-foot long boards flat would have meant reducing the size to under a ½ inch for a few of them. Shortening them would have required rethinking the top to be maybe more staggered like a hardwood floor, and I didn't want that. I tried one last ditch effort to use my 4/4 stock by gluing up 2 of the more notably twisted boards in opposition to each other, on the chance that they would essentially cancel each other out while creating a thicker board. That came very close to working, but not close enough to use. Whether from a lack of clamps or too much internal pressure on the boards, I simply couldn't get them to create a consistent glue bond over the entire board. So I punted on the idea of using 4/4 stock and went out to buy some 8/4 stock to build the top. My thinking was that the thicker lumber would be more resistant to warping in the first place, and even if it did move, I would at least have a lot more room to breathe in flattening it out. I also acclimated the new boards in my workshop for several weeks with quite a bit of weight on top to keep them flat while acclimating. These boards had minimal twist and only slight cupping. They were thick enough that I could use my thickness planer to cut down the curled up sides without too much concern that the rollers would just squeeze the board flat. I mean, you usually can't get rid of a lot of wood warpage in a planer, but in this very specific case, it does work. Next up was the need to joint the boards square. Unfortunately, at about 8 foot long and 2 inches thick, they were notably heavy, and my joiner bed is far too little to support their center of gravity on either end. So I needed some kind of external support that was coplanar with the joiner bed. My first attempt at a custom outfeed support was to use some scrap 2x4s and plywood to build a tray that I would then screw into the sides of a sturdy sawhorse. My thinking was that if I just made sure it was perfectly level while attaching everything together, then it'd be coplanar during use. But no, level does not mean coplanar, and I quickly discovered that my outfeed support was consistently inconsistent on its angles, and in the end, I couldn't get it to maintain the flat plane that I needed it to have. So I tried a second time, still using scrap 2x4s and plywood, but now using the clamps of my workmate to control the side-to-side motion better. Things too came very close to working, but in the end it was off by just too much that my jointed boards couldn't be guaranteed a coplanar landing point. I didn't bother creating a custom piece the third time and simply used a pair of rollers. That worked a lot better than I expected, and even if they weren't as precise as I would have liked, well, they were at least super consistent. So with the support in place, I could finally edge joint my board to get at least one square edge. I was already starting to see a bit more movement in the woods that I hoped for, but in most cases, not enough to throw off registering the face against the joiner fence. There was one wider board that proved to be a little bit tippy, and so in that case, I was mostly going for a consistent edge rather than a guaranteed square one. The thinking was that I just needed something that could register off my table saw fence, and then I could make 2 cuts rather than 1 to have square edges on both sides. Yeah, this took me a while to do what with the heavy and larger boards, but it's pretty standard milling procedure. Each board is edge jointed on one side, then moved over the table saw to rip it to width, then to the miter saw for rough length. There's a step through the thickness planer to get final thickness as well, but I didn't show that since I've showed enough going through the thickness planer already. Now for attaching the boards into a consistent wide panel. My original idea was to use dowels, and as my custom, I wanted to not only make my own dowels, but also to make my own dowel jig. That was a complete failure in the end, to such a degree that I actually made a separate video with the lessons learned while building it. See the link above, plus the link in the doobly-doo for more on that. What did work for me was to use standard biscuits to roughly align the boards. I mean, biscuits demonstrated to me that they have a lot more strength than you might think when I did some tests last year, but that wasn't the goal in this specific case. They are strictly for alignment here. This took a while to do because I could only glue together 2 boards at a time. This was largely because I was using normal wood glue, which normally has a working time of about 10 minutes, but in the extreme temperatures of my shop, that time was reduced significantly. I was a little bit worried that this might not work at all when I noticed that some of the glue appeared to be drying as I was finishing up laying it down. Yeesh. But yeah, it did seem to work out okay, so apparently there wasn't enough glue to compensate for all that. I glued up most of the board vertically so that the glue wouldn't drip away while applying it, but I couldn't do that with the last board, and that one went on its side. I had to exclusively use pipe clamps in the end because I didn't have any other clamps that were long enough. I alternated them on top and underneath to hopefully even out the stresses and to not create a notable cupping action just from the clamps. But the glued together tabletop was notably bowed anyway. I didn't do anywhere near as good of a job as reversing the grain pattern on the individual boards as I really should have, and as a result, most of them wanted to curl up in the same direction. I spent quite a bit of time trying to at least moderately flatten the top using a bench plane and my belt sander with a super aggressive grip. It was around this time that I moved everything to the patio behind my workshop. The temperatures in the workshop were rising pretty fast, and with just a little bit of humidity added to the mix, that actually made it somewhat difficult to breathe. Seriously. It was cooler on the patio due to the breeze. Anyway, a few of these shots show some parts of the board that look like maybe they're wet, sort of, and are darker than the surrounding bits. Those areas stink like sewage. Yeah, it's pretty bad. I'm not even sure what those areas are. Some kind of rot, maybe? Or fungus? The smell persisted through most of this process and didn't really go away until I got to the burning part. Weird. After the top was, give or take, flat enough, I moved on to the next step, which was preparing the breadboard ends. The breadboard ends were kind of a last minute change. They weren't in the original model and they're not in the original inspiration from Restoration Hardware. They were just something that I came across and I thought, those kind of look nice and they sort of look like what I was going for, so why not? Adding them started with cutting the ends of the top square using my skill saw and a guide. I then moved on to routing in the tenons. I built a custom edge guide that has zero clearance edge designed for this very specific straight bit. That way I could just clamp the edge right up to my line and be assured that my tenons would be also cut precisely to that line. The maximum bit depth was left the exact same on both sides so that the tenon would be exactly centered on the tabletop and would have a consistent thickness. Well, that latter bit turned out to be true. Each of the breadboard ends have an identical dado cut right down its center, and so they should have fit perfectly over the tenons. But what I forgot was that I had concentrated on planing and sanding away the high points on the edges of the top to flatten it all out. That meant that the edges were inconsistently thinner or thicker than the rest of the top. So when I ran my router over the top, I thought I was going around dead flat, but what I was actually going across on a sort of a wave pattern almost. That meant that I had to sand down the tenon in a few places to allow the dado to fit. And the most egregious fix needed was on one end where there was a gap of nearly 1/8 of an inch in the dado. Oops. Easy fix though. I just got a piece of scrap poplar the same shade as the end piece and trimmed it to fit in the gap. A little glue, flush cutting, and flush sanding, and it almost disappears. Simple. In keeping with the industrial look I was going for, I decided to attach the ends to the top using some pretty beefy lag bolts. They are completely and utter overkill for just keeping the ends on, since even a friction fit would probably be enough. But I like the look of the large bolts and washers, and so they're there for appearance sakes. All of the holes are pre-drilled. The hole in the end piece is larger than the bolt by a good 1/8 of an inch to give it plenty of room to move when the table expands and contracts. The hole into the top is a pilot hole, and so is spaced just smaller than the diameter of the bolt. That way the bolt is very securely attached to the top, but the ends can still float around when necessary. I installed the bolts as a test fit of sorts and then cut off the ends to final width. A belt sander is then used to flush up the ends with the top to be seamless. Well, for a little while at least. I will say that by the time I installed this top, the wood had moved enough that the ends were already visibly non-flush anymore. The construction phase on the top is now done, and so I moved on to the finishing phase. This started with the same texturing technique that I used on the table base. It essentially involves using a coarse wire brush on my angle grinder to carve in a roughed up texture. This step took longer than I thought it would, largely due to the size of the top and the fact that my back was just killing me when grinding away at the center of the table. I had to take a lot of breaks. Also, it was very notable how different parts of the wood reacted to the texturing. Some of the softer parts ground down deeper than I may have really intended, while some of the harder parts barely had a dent in them. I tried to make a random pattern across the entire top, but wasn't entirely successful with that. The pattern looked almost floral on the end pieces, like with vines maybe, and have a distinct, almost scale appearance on the top itself. A truly integrated pattern would have involved making the line span the entire length of the top, rather than just part of the top. Plus, I think I had the wheel at too high of an angle. The 90-degree angle to the wood made it a little too sharp of a line. The ideal angle appears to be maybe somewhere around 75 degrees, give or take a lot since it's entirely by eye. Well, lessons learned. And now, on to the most fun part of the build, the shou-sugi-ban step, where I burn the wood with a propane torch. Yeah, I'm probably mispronouncing that. A proper shou-sugi-ban would require Japanese cedar, where the shugi part comes from, and it also require the board to burn fully for several minutes so that the top 1/8 inch or so of the board chars. It's this charred part that gives the board their notable protective coating. But I'm not doing it like that, because I'm not doing it for the protective qualities and rather for the look of the burned board. As such, I wanted to just burn the wood enough to turn black, and not enough to let it char at all. Honestly, I probably could have got a similar look with some kind of black dye. But no, I wanted to burn this. I did one side with a handheld propane torch. This is just normal propane, since something like MAF gas would be extreme overkill. I did use one of those auto start tips, which are highly recommended since they don't cost that much more than a tip that requires a sparker, but are so much easier to use. And as an aside, before I did this project, I would have told you that the top player in this field was Benzematic, since they made most of the handheld torches, right? Benzematic. It wasn't until I looked closely at the label that I realized that the name is, and always has been, Bernzomatic. That R has been there all along, and I never saw it until now. Anyway, I kept the torch moving and stayed in one area just long enough to turn the wood black before moving on. For the other side of the top, I decided to use my flamethrower. It's a larger propane torch used for burning weeds of all things, and it's a huge amount of fun to use. I did want to show this first bit though. See how the flame is just wimpy and anemic? That's because I had the flow control too open when I started it, and the automatic limiter kicked in. I had to do quite a bit of searching to find out what the root cause of this is and what I was doing wrong, so hey, now I know. Start out slow. When it's going for real, it creates a bright blue flame that's maybe a foot or two long and sounds like a jet engine. The flame doesn't really show up on video for some reason, but it's pretty visible in person. And it's much louder than you think in person as well, and super hot. It's also much faster than burning with a handheld torch, and quite a bit more fun to do. But that's not all for the finish. The next step was to flood over the burnt wood with Minwax Classic Gray stain. The stain doesn't really soak into the burnt areas very well, but does seep into anything that's not burnt. So when I wipe it off, I'm left with a very random pattern of blackened burnt areas with darker gray areas. The textured grooves also start to pop quite a bit more, especially with the light shining on it. The breadboard ends need to be attached for real at this stage, and it was right about here when I discovered that apparently my top massively curled during the burning stage. Maybe that makes sense, since the burning would likely flash off quite a bit of moisture in the wood, I guess? I didn't predict that in any event. But yeah, massively curled. To get the ends on the tenons, I first had to straighten out the top by clamping on a 2x4 straight edge of sorts. And that allowed me to slip on the end piece, and that piece actually did a reasonable job of keeping the table at least a little flat and not egregiously bowed. The final finishing step was to apply a few coats of polyacrylic. I wanted a fast drying clear coat with a very matte finish, and I've had very good luck with polyacrylic in the past. I applied it by hand with a brush rather than spraying because, I'm not actually remembering why. It would have been much faster with a sprayer, that's for sure. Why didn't I use my sprayer? Huh. Oh well, I applied 3 coats with a light sanding in between. I was able to apply the coats in one day due to the fast dry time, but it still took me a couple of days to actually do the whole thing since I needed to do both sides. I decided to attach the base to the top using bolts and threaded inserts. The idea was to have a table that was very securely attached when bolted together, but could still be taken apart to move it without any real problems. The holes in the base were all countersunk for the bolt and washer, and then were drilled oversized to give the bolt some room to move. I put down masking tape to indicate the center and 2 outer edges of the base. It's just there as a surface that I could write on since, well, my pencil won't show up at all in the very dark top. But with this, I could center the base once and then mark the edges of where it is, and then know that I could recenter it in a jiffy at any point later. I used the holes in the base to mark out where the threaded inserts needed to go. Installing them meant drilling the right size holes the correct depth and then really just screwing it in. I first tried a bolt and nut combo with my ratchet wrench, which is what you usually see done with threaded inserts. But I found that the insert wanted to uninstall itself whenever I backed out the bolt. So in the end, I just used the Allen wrench that was the right size. I did not epoxy these inserts in, but really definitely should have. They have a tendency to back themselves out when snugging down the bolts coming in through the base. It's not critical, but having them epoxied in place would have made this a little bit easier to attach. And notably, the bolts I used to attach the base to the top are the only ones not painted black, since, well, they're going to be invisible in typical use. And that's really it. I'm done. All that remains is bringing it inside and attaching the base and top together into a final finished dining room table. The top weighs maybe 120 pounds, so my panel carrier really came in handy for that. And here's the completed table in its natural environment. These finished photos mostly just show that I'm a terrible photographer, since, well, the table looks a lot more interesting in person than it does in these shots. Still, I'm probably more happy about the final result of this project than I have with any other project I've done to date, so there's that. And as always, thanks for watching.